And there we go.
Thanks,
Hello, everybody. My name.
Hey.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Hans. I think everyone knows I'm Matt Clare. I work with the Sakai Accessibility Working Group, and I'm really excited that Hans Hillen from the Paciello Group, which he can correct me on, TPG, is going to give us a presentation and work through some applied issues with keyboard accessibility in Sakai. We've got a lot of initiatives around accessibility in Sakai, a lot of support both in all forms of resources and a lot of concern. And I think we have a lot of success as well. One area where we can focus our efforts is keyboard accessibility. When NYU very generously offered their resources through TPG to the community, we were trying to think of an area that might be really good to build some knowledge in the developer community. And keyboard accessibility came up as a area where we could use some improvements in areas, and also a area that a lot of people can relate to and test. So I know I've been seeing Hans's work across the web as I've been looking up issues, especially around jQuery. So I'm really excited for this, and I'm going to turn it over to Hans to take us through it.
Thanks. So my name is Hans Hillen. I'm with the Paciello Group, which is also known as TPG. I'm an accessibility consultant, so we help companies and other groups with their accessibility issues. We do testing, and I also do development work every now and then. So I know what it's like, to approach things from the developer side and also from the accessibility side. And I try to find a good balance between those two. So in this session, we're going to talk specifically about keyboard accessibility and focus-related issues. I've been looking through some of the JIRAS that were provided about your project, and so I'll be using some of those as examples as well. So keep in mind that we're focusing on keyboard accessibility. We're not going to be talking about screen reader support, which is a whole different topic that would require a lot more than this little time slot that we have here. So in this session, what we will cover, I'm going to go over some of the core principles of keyboard accessibility. We're going to talk about visual indication of focus. We're going to talk about custom controls and how they relate to keyboard accessibility. And I'm going to give some ground rules for focus management. And then we're going to look at some of the JIRAS. And if you have any questions, I'll probably stop every now and then, but there'll also be some time at the end where we can have questions, or if you want to suggest looking at certain parts of your application, we can do that as well. And I don't know if everybody can unmute in that case when they have questions, or if we're going to use the chat feature for this through the presentation tool, but I'm sure we'll figure that out. So the main principles of keyboard accessibility are pretty simple, and those principles are that every interactive control or feature must be reachable by keyboard and operable by keyboard. We're going to drill down a bit more into specifics now, but whenever you develop something, whenever you develop a UI, it sometimes can help to put your mouse aside and just see, okay, well, can I actually reach that widget or that control that I built, or can I actually perform that action without having a mouse? So can you reach it, and can you operate it? Can you interact with it? And once you start looking out for that, you basically covered all your bases, because you'll soon find that, oh, I couldn't actually get to that part, or I couldn't get to that toolbar, or I couldn't navigate that drop-down menu. So once you put your mouse aside and you do a little bit of testing yourself, then you'll find, okay, well, that doesn't work, so how can I make it work? So what do we mean when we say controls must be reachable? Well, first of all, it means that the controls must be focusable, and the focus order must be logical. So you're probably familiar with the tab order of a web page. And the tab order is basically your main go-to for making interactive controls reachable. So the natural tab order of a web page contains every natively focusable control, so that's and form controls and buttons and things like that. And in some cases also scrollable containers. And it also contains elements that you've given a tab index value of 0 to. So the tab index value of 0 is useful because it allows you to place elements that were not natively focusable into the tab order. So if you're building a custom widget, like you have a tree view or a custom checkbox or something that's just created from divs and spans, or slider, you can make that focusable and part of the tab order by adding a tab index value of 0. And this is pretty much the main way that you should use the tab index attribute. So if you give it a value of 0, it becomes part in the tab order in the right place of where it would normally be if it was a natively focusable element. It's not recommended to give tab index values of higher than 0 because that creates a custom tab order. And you may have used that in the past. So if you feel like, oh, the layout doesn't match, the logical order of this page, so I'm going to use a custom tab order and add a tab index value of 1 and then a tab index value of 2 to each focusable element. But you always run into maintenance issues with that. First of all, it's hard to get it right. Second, the fact that you have to use that custom tab order indicates that there's a problem with the logical order of your layout. And third, whenever there's a change happening later, like parts are removed or added or rearranged in your site, then all of a sudden your tab order doesn't make sense anymore. So pretty much you only allowed values, I would say, for tab index are 0 or -1, and -1 is used to actually take something out of the tab order. And I will talk more about that later, of what kind of situation you would want to do that. There's some other methods you can use for reaching controls, like shortcuts. Of course, there's access keys. And there's also composite widgets like trees or tab lists or grids, which are larger widgets that consist of smaller parts that are individually focusable. And these composite widgets generally are managed in one of two ways. You can either have a roving tab index or an area that's actually the descendant attribute. And I'll give a little demo for both of what that means. So this is an example of a tree widget. And by the way, if you're not seeing me switching the screen yet, that means there's a big lag. So if you don't see the different page now with the tree view on it, let me know. And otherwise, I'll just continue. So this is a composite widget, this tree view, in the sense that it only takes up one tab stop. And that means I can tap into it and out of it with one tab key press. So this is different compared to the way interactive component used to work on a website, kind of before the whole Web 2.0 craze started, where all of these individual items would have been focusable. But you want to try to declutter tab order. You don't want to have too many tab stops. And especially with things like grids or tree views, you can have a lot of tab stops, like there could be dozens or hundreds of them. So how do you then navigate to the other parts of the tree? So in this case, you don't use tab for that, but you use the arrow keys. You can use up and down and left and right. And these are kind of the expected shortcuts for a tree view. Now, this particular tree view uses what's called a roving tab index to manage its internal focus. So what that means is, I'll show it here in the web inspector. Here, the actual tree item element. So you can see all three items. So that's an area role and some other area attributes. And you can see that it has a tab index value of 0. So that means that that element is in the tab order. Look at some of the other tree items in this tree. You see that those items currently have a tab index value of -1. So that means that they're not in the tab. And basically what you do is whenever you switch focus to a new branch, which is handled by the arrow key event handlers in this case, whenever you switch focus, you update the tab index attribute. So currently it's still set to 0. And now that I moved focus to a different, it's now set to -1. You can see there's always only one item in this tree that is part of the tab order. And that's why we call it the roving tab index, because you keep adjusting part of the tree is in the tab order. You keep adjusting what tab index is 0 and which other ones are -1. So you can use your scripts to handle that and declutter the tab order. Now the other example that I mentioned was to use the area-actor descendant attribute. So here I have another tree example. So again, it has branches that can be expanded or collapsed. Now if we look at the code here, you can see that on these three elements there's no tab index attribute at all. And that's because this particular tree uses a different approach, which is area-actor descendant. And that's something that that's an attribute that you place on the outer components wall. So that could be a tree or a list box or a grid, for example. In which case, that widget is the element that has the DOM focus, so to speak. So that has the tab index attribute. And this area-actor descendant attribute references the ID of the subpart that is supposed to be focused. If I interact with this, you can see as I move around that it's updating the ID value of the area-actor descendant attribute. And the builder will expose that to media users, for example, as if those sub-items were the ones that had focus. So you can see it's slightly different to the roving tab index approach, but it allows you to have a composite widget with one tab stop that's navigated internally through arrow key navigation. Are there any questions about that? Of course, it's not just arrow key navigation. Sometimes there's also other shortcuts like page up, page down, home, end, escape, and whatever widget makes or whatever shortcut makes sense. I mean, in some cases, like a tree view, you can usually use a first letter search. So you type in a letter, and it will automatically skip to that part of the tree item that starts with that letter.
At times, your audio appears to be breaking up pretty badly. Several of us are experiencing that, making it kind of hard to hear you.
I wonder if there's something I can do about that, like dialing in or something.
I'm sorry.
What do you want me to do?
Oh, I'm not sure. It says Sean that says, I think it's a bandwidth issue on your side. Whenever you change a lot on the screen, that's when he's noticing the audio gets worse. So maybe slow down the changing, or maybe wait for the change to happen before you start speaking. I guess will be the inference there.
Is there a possibility to dial in like through a phone?
Yeah, there's a dial-in number. And Matt just pasted it right there. There's so. And we'd be happy to wait a minute for you to do that if you want.
I guess you can't pause it. You can only stop the recording, right?
I'll just leave it going. I guess I can stop it. We'll say, okay, I'll stop it and then start it again. Sure.
Yeah, actually. So, but he needs an international number.
Let it go.
Oh, an international number?
I'm gonna. Well, I'll dial it through Skype. The last minute I'll toll free.
Okay. Okay, recording started back up.
So, most traditional web content is pretty straightforward when it comes to keyword accessibility, like links and form controls and buttons and all the native controls that are provided by the HTML spec basically have accessibility built in. So, you can tap to them. If there's a select element, you can use the arrow keys to move up and down. If there's a button that you can activate it by space or enter, and the same for checkboxes. But what happens when you have a more complicated widget, like for example, a custom slider or a tree view, like I just showed? Like, how do you know what shortcuts you need for that? So the best resource that I can think of is the Area Authoring Practices Guide, which is basically continuously in development, but it's still, in its current state, a very good resource. So, for example, if you wanted to know how do I mark up a tree view, like what kind of keyword behavior do I need for that, you just skip the tree view, and it will describe exactly how it should be built up, what kind of area markup should be used, and what the keyword behavior is. So it will explain single selection, multiple selection. So if you ever build a custom widget, or you use it or test a custom widget, you want to know, what the expected keyword behavior is. This is a very good resource, because then you just know, okay, well, I need to support these shortcuts here. And again, it's also a good resource for what area markup to use. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is the visual indication of focus. And I had a thing here. One of the JIRAS that I saw dealt about this. So visual indication of focus is important because unlike mouse users, keyboard users don't really have a cursor that they can move around to see what they're currently interacting with. So if you're a keyboard user, and you can see, obviously, this is not so much applicable for screen reader users, but if you're a keyboard user, you need to know where your focus is, and the only way that you can know that when you're tabbing through an interface is if there's a good, clear indication of focus. So on this page from Sakai, for example, if I tab through this page, you can see that there is kind of a default focus indication provided by the browser, and in some cases it works, like here on these tabs, for example, and in some cases it doesn't work so much, for example, on kind of darker backgrounds. You can imagine if you have poor sight, or you're a low vision user of some kind, it could be more difficult to see focus highlights like this in certain cases. The other problem with relying on the default visual indication of focus is that not every browser does it, as well as Chrome does. So, For example, Firefox and Internet Explorer will have that thin dotted line, which is often very difficult to see. So we generally recommend for developers to come up with a stronger, explicitly defined visual indication of focus, because then you can also make distinctions like, well, if it's on a dark background, we'll give it a lighter highlight, and if it's on a light background, we'll give it a dark highlight. But then there's some cases where even the default focus doesn't show up. So for example, now my focus is on my workspace link on the left here. I'm going to tap into the actions drop-down button. And focus actually moved there, but there's no visual indication that that button was focused. So I can interact with it, but you don't see that it was focused. So that's a problem. That's not just an issue of, well, there's a highlight, but it's not sufficient enough. This is really just, there is no highlight at all. And this is something that you often find that either, developers will try to suppress the native outline, or the library that you uses, or whatever, reset CSS style sheet that you use will kind of try to override that. So let's have a look here and see what's going on. If I look at the button and I simulate a focus state, if you look down a little bit, you can see that where the problem is. So in this case, there's an outline property set to 0. So that means that whenever this element receives focus, it doesn't have an outline, and that outline happens to be exactly what is used to indicate focus. So that's not good. So what I'm going to do is change this just to illustrate. Obviously, you would have a more permanent solution in your code if you wanted to do this. So let's say change it to solid navy, 2 pixels. I try to recommend people to have strong outlines that are at least 2 pixels thick. And I know that the designers amongst you will cringe when I say that, but I'll have some more to say about that later. One thing that you can see here, that even though there's a blue outline, because the button is blue itself, it's still not that easy to see, because the outline and the button color are very similar, and it's difficult to find an outline color that has both sufficient contrast to the element that it's outlining as well as the background. Because if we were to make this outline lighter, it will be too light to, it will kind of disappear against a white background. So one thing you can do for that is to use the outline offset property, and let's say set it to 1 pixel, and that way you get this nice little gap in between to kind of separate it from the element itself. And in fact, why not just apply this to everything on the page? I'm just gonna cheat and use the important keyword here to override everything. So now when I tap through this page, we can see that we get this really nice, strong outline for everything that's really easy to see. And again, if you were to be on a darker selector, like here, you could change that to white, for example. Now, when I say nice, I say that as an accessibility person. So I like this because it's very easy to see. So I know that keyboard users with sight problems won't have any issues with that. But as I said, developers won't like this because they think it looks ugly, and your users may end up filing bug reports because they think it's they click on a button and all of a sudden it has this thick line around it and they don't know what that is, so they think it's a bug and they want it to be fixed. So there is actually a proposed solution for that to kind of make that easier to swallow for designers to have a strong indication of focus. And that is the proposed focus ring property. So it's not in CSS yet, but there is a polyfill for it here, which I'll provide the link for later. And basically what it does is if you use that property, and I have a demo here, the browser will make a distinction between whether the element was focused by keywords or by mouse. So for example, if I tab through these controls, it has that strong outline that I was talking about. But if I were to click on this button, for example, and as you probably know, when you click on an interactive control, it gets focused. It will move focus to the button, but you won't see the outline. So if I, just to prove that my focus is actually on that button, if I press tab now, it goes from there. But you don't see it when you click the actual control. That's kind of what you want, because the average user is not even going to see those outlines in this case, because a lot of people use a mouse, so they won't really notice that there is an outline for keyboard users. And the people who do need it, the keyboard users, won't mind that it's there because it makes it easier for them to see. And the idea is that it does actually make a distinction between certain input fields, like things that have text input. They would actually get the outline or when you click on it as well. So you can use that polyfill if you're having trouble convincing yourself or your designers to apply stronger visual indications of focus. This is kind of something to soften the blow, I guess, in a way that keyword users get what they need, and your site won't look that much different for mouse users. Any questions about that?
Yeah, Tiffany was asking in the chat if you wouldn't mind cutting and pasting or copying that link if it's public, we can play with it.
Yeah, I'll provide a whole list of all the things at the end, but I'll give you the link here. So this is something that Rob Dodson from Google has worked on.
Thanks.
All right, so focus management. What are the ground rules? You always need to know where your focus is. And that means that your focus always needs to be moved to a place where it makes sense. Don't allow your focus to get lost. So quite often in an application, when you interact with something as a keyboard user, like you're expanding or collapsing a tree branch or something, or you're switching tabs, or you're changing the sorting direction on a sortable grid or table, your focus will just kind of disappear, or it will be kind of reset to the document itself. And for keyboard users, that's quite annoying if they're performing a task that requires multiple, changes. So for example, if I had maybe you can help me with this. Where was the page that had like a long list of expandable components? It was like a grid. I just had it open before I had to restart, so sorry about that.
It might be in preferences.
Yeah, preferences was another one. No, but there was a list of there was a list of meetings, I think it was.
Oh, okay, yeah, that would be in the site and the sign up tool.
Sign up tool.
We'll grab the sites on the top right there.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And then sample 01. And signups hopefully in there.
I don't think it is. Well, anyway, it was basically a list of expandable meetings. I think it was, and we'll probably get to it when we go over some of the JIRAS. But whenever you expand or collapse one of those meetings, the page would kind of reset and your focus would be lost, and you would have to start all the way tabbing from the beginning. So, you need to think about what's the user doing, interacting with something that he may want to continue interacting with at that point. So it might not be beneficial to have a loss of focus in that case. Another case where focus is often lost is the use of dialogue. So I noticed that in your application, there were some dialogues used, for example, for the chat. So this is kind of what we call a tooltip dialogue, kind of a dialogue that expands from a button. And I think there was also one for, which one was it? Can you give me any examples of a dialogue in your application? Oh, this one, for example. So if you close this dialogue, your focus will be reset to the start of the page. In this case, as a keyboard user, you move to the sides button, you open the dialogue, the focus moves into the dialogue, that's good. But at that point, you wanted to, when you close the dialogue, you wanted to move back to the element that triggered it. So you need to kind of watch that close event for the dialogue. Remember what element was used to open it, and if that element still exists at that point, move focus back to it so that the user can just go back and start navigating from there. I mean, in this case, it's near the start of the page, so it's not a big deal. But you can imagine if there was a dialogue, triggered from somewhere in the middle of the page, it would be quite annoying that you have to tab all the way back. So here's a example for the Bootstrap accessibility plugin, which I saw some of you mentioned in the JIRA comments as well. So the Bootstrap accessibility plugin is a plugin used for to fix some accessibility problems in Bootstrap without having to modify the Bootstrap code itself. So if you look at this dialog, you can see that my focus is currently on the launch demo model button. I can tap into this dialog, I can press it with escape, close it, and my focus will be back on this button. And I can continue tapping from there. And similarly, I have another dialog here. This one that I worked on for jQuery UI. Press escape, and focus moves back to the trigger element. So whenever you have a situation where something moves focus into a different context temporarily, like a dialog, make sure that when it closes, your focus moves back to where it was when the dialog opened. Now, another thing that's important about dialogues is that you want to constrain the tab order within it. So you can see here with these dialogues that I've shown as examples, if I keep tabbing, I'm not able to tab out of it. It goes back to, it wraps basically, the beginning and the end, and that's what you want. And I saw there was a JIRA bug for that as well, which we'll look at later. And that's basically what the Bootstrap plugin that I showed. What was it? Has the same thing. So even though it's a long dialogue, it kind of scrolls. It goes back to the top and back to the bottom. So when you have a custom dialogue that you built yourself or that you have control over yourself, you need to make sure that it behaves like that. So you need to check for the tab key event at the end and the beginning. You also need to check that, it's simply not possible to move focus into the background. In some cases, dialogues allow you to click and it will automatically close. But if it's a modal dialogue, then even that shouldn't be possible. And the dialogue should only be closable by escape or any button in there that allows it to close. And mentioning escape, that's another important feature, that whenever you have something that flies out or pops up or shows up like a dialogue or drop-down list or anything that kind of expands temporarily, it needs to be closable through escape, because that's a common keyboard behavior that people tend to expect. So when you open a dialog, move focus into it. When you close it, put it back where it was. Constrain the tab order inside of it. And while the user is interacting with something, don't allow it to lose focus. Moving on to skipping mechanisms. So if you have a website with a lot of tab stops in it, with a cluttered tab order, it's very helpful if you can skip over those controls. So for example, on the Sakai page, there is a little shortcut skip links here that allows you to use shortcut keys or jump to the main content. And that's helpful for allowing keyboard users to quickly navigate the page. People often think that skip links are most useful for screen reader users, but it's really more about sighted keyboard users, because screen reader users are able to use their screen reader shortcuts to skip to elements of any kind of type. So they can skip to headings, they can skip to the next paragraph, they can skip to the next image. So they can really jump around quite well. But it's the keyboard users that only have their keyboard, basically. They don't have any special software to navigate the page. So those are the people that really need the skipping mechanisms. And it would be ideal if browser vendors would provide keyboard accessible heading navigation so that you can just skip from heading to heading as a keyboard user. But for some reason they refuse to provide shortcuts for that. So you're still kind of stuck with things like skip links, even though they're kind of annoying to use. But if you do use them, the way you've done it here is a good approach, in the sense that they're not necessarily permanently visible, so they don't take up any screen estate. But if you're a keyboard user and you're tabbing through the page, you're gonna invariably tab past them and you're gonna see what they are. So they're good discoverable skip links. I'll show you some other examples of custom keyboard behavior and how that can work. The other one that I didn't mention here was collapsible content. If you have a lot of controls with a lot of tab stops, it can sometimes help to make that section collapsible. For example, going back to the app, in the preferences section that we mentioned before, there are actually collapsible sections, even though they only kind of reveal one tab stop for the radio buttons. But the problem is that these sections themselves are only mouse accessible. So if we look at the code here, and I saw on the JIRA bug that this was actually marked as fixed, so it could be that I'm just looking at an older version and that it's already been resolved in the current version. But in this case, it's just a static element, a legend, which is not focusable by itself. That is responding to a click event, and that click event will only work for mouse users in this case. So if you use a click event for something like a button or a checkbox or something, that will work for keyboard users because the browser will automatically listen for the space and enter key there and fire the click event for you. If you're using a custom element like a span or div or legend or list item or an image or something, that automatic behavior isn't there. So in this case, on the click literally means click. It doesn't mean simulate click through enter. So in this case, you would have to first of all make this element focusable. By adding a tab index value. So now it's part of the tab order. Obviously, you would need to give it some kind of meaningful role through area for screen reader users. And then you need to add your own key event handlers. So you can, for example, say, I want this to respond to the enter key. So you add a key press event handler or key up event handler. You say, okay, well, I want this to be, when the enter key is pressed, I want to simulate a click event, or I want the same function to be called that the click event handler calls. Or you could say, I want this to be expandable like a tree view with left and right arrow keys. So it's pretty straightforward, but it's something that you can easily forget when things like this are implemented. So first of all, make sure that it's reachable with the tab index attribute in this case. And second, make sure that it's operable by adding those key event handlers. But yeah, collapsible content is a useful skipping mechanism as well. If you have a lot of links in a pane on your page, you could just say, okay, well, you can collapse that whole pane, and then the keyboard user won't have to deal with it. Now you have a similar thing here in your interface where you can kind of narrow the toolbar on the left, and as one of the JIRAS mentions, the button itself is not focusable, so keyboard users can't really do that. But even if they can do it, it wouldn't really help as a skipping mechanism here because the buttons themselves, even though they're smaller, are still part of the tab order, so they would still have to tab through it. So this is not necessarily a skipping mechanism, even though I initially thought it was. Drag and drop is one of those tricky things that is hard to get a keyboard accessible. But whenever you provide drag and drop, it has to be keyboard accessible as well. Keyboard users need to be able to provide the same functionality that mouse users can do. Often you don't literally want to mimic the dragging and dropping behavior, but you just want to, provide some equivalent feature that does the same thing as a drag and drop result. I have a little example here from a real life page, which is Google Sites. So Google Sites actually has an interesting interface, which takes a little while to get used to, but once you're used to it as a keyboard user, it's actually quite good. So I can tab through the controls at the top here, but when I get to the actual layout sections that I'm adding in this site, I can actually press enter to move that section into a draggable state. And I can move it up or down and rearrange things. So these are things that you can do as a mouse user by dragging and dropping. But here, this application allows us to do this keyboard users as well. I can rearrange these images or change them to their own row. And if I hold down Alt, I can resize them. So you can basically do everything that you can do as a mouse user with the keyboard. You might also see that when I'm dragging this image here, there's a toolbar that becomes available. And Google Sites actually provides a shortcut for that as well, which is in this case Control-Shift-X. And that puts focus in this toolbar and allows me to interact with all of that. So you can see that they've everything that's in this UI, even though they use a very unusual interface, because I'm doing this by arrow key navigation, which is what they chose to use. They've made sure that everything is keyboard accessible. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you have a custom interface, it's okay if it's custom and it's not just tab into things, as long as you make sure that everything is keyboard accessible. And the other thing is, which is going to be on my next slide here, discoverability. So if you use custom behavior, it needs to be discoverable by keyboard users as well as screen reader users. So you need to provide documentation about how your custom interaction works. And when I say custom, it's basically anything other than just tabbing through things and and pressing enter to activate them. Provide documentation and provide inline help. So if I switch back to Google Sites, they actually, because obviously these are very unusual shortcuts with the arrow keys and the Control Shift and X. Obviously, most users won't know that you can do that. So they have a shortcut, which is Command question mark or Control question mark on Windows, and they will tell you all the shortcuts that you need. So, for example, moving focus to the toolbar, they explain that here. So if you're lost as a Google user, and they do this for all their other Google applications as well, you just use that shortcut and you get your context-dependent information about what shortcuts you can use. I'll give another example here just to show that Google doesn't always get it right. If I want to change the alt attribute for this image, I go to this Add Alt Text option. When I'm typing and I press the backspace key to delete the text character here, it actually deletes the whole image. And that's because by default, you can delete images with backspace, and they clearly didn't catch their events properly there. So that's just a bug, but it's an example of a problem for keyboard users where they're causing a loss of focus as a result of keyboard interaction. I'm still typing, I'm using backspace, and all of a sudden the whole image is deleted, and the thing that I was editing is gone. But that's just an example of a problem that can easily occur for keyboard users. So I think we've gotten to the questions part and part where we're going to look at some more JIRAS. So if there are any questions, now's the time to ask. I'll have a look at the chat as well.
Hans, I wonder if you could expand on drag and drop to HTML5's file drag and drop. It seems a little special.
Yeah, what do you want to know about it? I don't know.
Is there a way to do it accessibly, or is an alternative the only option?
I don't really know, to be honest. Is this the HTML5 new feature to drag and drop files?
So I know in Sakai's case, we implemented it in Sakai 10, and if someone knows the technical term for it, that'd be helpful right now. And we had our old switch back to the form element to use the form file browser, and then it got removed in 10 and in 11 and later. And I don't know how to make the drag and drop hotspotty thing work with a keyboard.
Right. So I mean, obviously, it would be easier if we could just look in a specific example. So my answer is going to be a bit generic, but basically, as long as you have a finite amount of drop targets, it's doable. So, I mean, I'm not talking about like, oh, this is some kind of graphic editor where you can just, you know, have an infinite amount of things that you can drag and drop something to. I'm talking about like, oh, I'm picking up a file and I have a fixed amount of folders that I can drag this file to, for example. If you have a finite amount of drop targets, there's something you can figure out. So you can either do what Google Sites did, where you go into this draggable state, and you kind of use tab or arrow keys to loop over all the available drop targets. Or you could, for example, have a context menu for that item, where the context sub menu kind of has like a move to item where that lists all the available drop targets. So for example, if you have a file that you're picking up and there's a fixed amount of folders that you can drag it to, you could have those folders listed in the move to submenu. Like I said, it's a bit of a generic answer, but as long as there are a limited amount of drop targets, it's something that you can achieve. Any other questions?
I think there's one working through in the chat about organized favorites.
Yeah, I see.
You are now unmuted.
Hey Tiffany, yeah, it's Jeff. So yeah, that's the case. I mean that sites, home preferences sites, that's really just preserve the ability to hide sites. But yeah, there's no dragging and dropping there. I mean, I'm not sure how keyboard accessible that particular page is, but I think that would definitely need a JIRA for the sites modal to be able to get over to organized favorites, because yeah, it doesn't look like we can now.
So it used to be that when you had the old in Sakai 10, the reorder sites in my workspace preferences, you could reorder them with a keyboard, and it was fairly easy. There was a list of how to do it, and I added that in our help too, how to organize them with a keyboard, drag them and drop them. And the same dragging and dropping that used to be the way you did it with sites happens now still, I believe, in lessons when you're reordering pages there. So if that could be brought back, I guess, to the preferences page, it could at least be an alternative for keyboard users to be able to reorder them, even though they currently can't access a reorder feature at all, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could probably put that effort into just making the organized sites tab within the sites modal keyboard accessible, and then maybe we can work on some sort of reordering mechanism for that, and maybe that's something, I don't know if we have time to hit it today, but maybe that's something we can chat with Hans on for future calls.
Yeah. I mean, basically, and I guess that's kind of the bad news, is that whenever you use drag and drop, there's never really a built-in fix for keyboard accessibility. You always kind of have to customize it yourself to kind of achieve the same result. Like even if you have drag and drop support in jQuery UI and libraries like that, they generally only focus on mouse users. Any other questions?
I wanted to ask about PayPal's Bootstrap accessibility plugin. I don't want to generally, but I don't want to take an opportunity to talk specifically about something from anyone else.
Well, I guess we can talk about that.
Is it a panacea? The way it gets merged into someone's use of Bootstrap, I'm not quite clear because it looks very generic as far as its download versus what Bootstrap ships with, and but and then what are the things to watch out for if you implemented it?
Well, I mean, I know that the people who built it and the way that they approach it is that there's things in Bootstrap that are less than perfect for accessibility. I mean, overall they're okay, but there's just the issue here and there. So they just rather and people are trying to get those things fixed in Bootstrap, but you always kind of hit a wall at some point of this library people don't really want to change certain things. So these people who were working at PayPal at the time wanted to just have a little plugin to override some of the things that they knew were accessibility issues. So from what I've seen, it doesn't cause any issues, and it's just overriding certain styles and certain script things. And it will help fix things like keywords issues with the dialogue, for example. So it's something you can try out. I mean, it's obviously not a fix for everything, but it just has a few fixes that they describe in their documentation. And I mean, obviously we'll have to see for Bootstrap 4 if that's going to be updated as well, but it's something you can use that avoids you having to implement some of these fixes yourself.
Cool, thanks. I'm definitely trying it with the bookmark lit. Some of the color contrast stuff we wouldn't expect, I guess, to be adopting out of their plugin because of the way Sakai is set up. But JavaScript changes would count for a lot.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, with the themes and everything in Bootstrap, it's in your application, you would want to be in control of that. So if you have a color contrast issue, you probably just want to, regenerate the Bootstrap CSS yourself, like with Sass or something, and have it change the colors, the color variables there. But yeah, it was just an example. Obviously there's other plugins as well, and we all kind of try to get things accessible, but there's no perfect library out there at the moment that does everything completely right.
Well, that's why your advice counts for so much here. Sean was asking in the chat room, for element focus, can the hover, hover property or state be used in most cases? For example, rather than using outline, can those focus elements be styled like the hover state, such as change backgrounds or colors? That is to say, the focus state would use the same styles as the hover state.
Yeah, so a lot of people do that. It really depends on how well your hover state is visible, because, for example, Google does that a lot. Their outlines are kind of faint, although they have all these tooltips, which really helps, that are keyword accessible as well. But if you have a strong change of appearance on hover, you can use it for keyword as well. But often these hover states are this very faint, like, oh, the button goes from light gray to a slightly less light gray. And somebody with 20/20 vision might be able to see that. Somebody with poor vision might not. It's definitely a step in the right direction. But like I said, I always recommend to use the outlines because they're visible in high contrast mode as well, whereas changes it to the background color are often not, because that background color won't be there anymore. So your first priority is to make sure that there is some kind of visual indication of focus, and then your second priority is to have that indication of focus be easily noticeable. And I would definitely recommend having a look at that polyfill to if you don't like ugly outlines, to just have it there for keyword users only. So the answer is kind of yes and no. That's okay, and also not okay sometimes.
Sean says thanks.
Right.
That's an interesting idea, Sean. Thanks.
So I mean, we've talked about some of these JIRAS already. Most of what I've seen were about expand collapse controls not being focusable. So we've talked about how to deal with that. Make sure it's reachable by keyboard, and then make sure that it responds to the right key event handlers. So this, for example, is the thing in the preference pane that we talked about, the expandable sections. That's 31619. Some of these I wasn't able to reproduce because the instance of Sakai that I had access to just didn't seem to have certain features, or didn't seem to have like the right populated content for meetings, for example. So I couldn't really say much about that. But all of it seemed pretty straightforward. It was either a problem with getting focus to something, or something not being focusable, or was a problem where the keyword visual indication of focus wasn't indicated, like this one here, 31610. That actually deals with that exact button that I was demoing before. There was an issue about the dialogues. It's 31587. So we talked about that, and this one was already marked as fixed as well. And there were a few area-related ones which we're not going to talk about now. This one was interesting. This is 31621. Ensure keyboard focus is not provided to inactive elements. So when I read this, I first thought that this was about disabled elements that are usually taken out of the tab order. But it was actually something else, and I think it was it in the preference pane? No, where was this particular bug from? It was a tab list where each tab stop took up two, or each tab took up two tab stops in the tab order. Of course, now I can't find it anymore. And basically what happened was there were tabs with spans inside of them, and those spans had tab index values of 0 as well. So you had to press tab twice for each tab. So you got double the tab stops, and yeah, you can see it here. So that's a simple case of removing the tab index values of those spans. And there's more about area, visual indication of focus. This is about the click events in the preferences pane. And more about area. So that's all the bugs that are in this list. So the ones that are there are pretty straightforward. And I think that the UI, Sakai UI in general, is pretty straightforward because you mostly use kind of traditional controls. So, I don't think it should be too difficult to make it all keyword accessible. But if you have any questions about it, I guess we can talk about it more in the meetings. Which I guess we're still having every 2 weeks, right? So feel free to create new JIRAS and bring them up. And if anything falls out of the stuff that we've talked about today, then we can come up with a solution for those. I guess that's the end, unless there's any other questions.
I don't see any coming in the chat. I know a lot of people have to get to things, start their days or end their days. Unless someone wants to jump in there, I'll give you a big thanks, Hans. That was really a great presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I was trying to make notes and correlate JIRAs as we went. And I think we had a good conversation about organized sites too, which might have a positive impact. So I don't want to keep anyone too long, but thanks again, Hans. Thanks, NYU, for facilitating this. If you're interested in joining our regular Sakai Accessibility teleconference every other Wednesday at 1 o'clock Eastern, you're welcome to do that. Our next one is Wednesday, April 26th, 1300 EDT, which is 1700 GMT. And there'll be a reminder going out to the Sakai Dev mailing list if that date math is too tricky. We're also in Big Blue Button room 4 for that. But I'll give one last big thanks, and thank you everyone who participated with the session. All the best.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys.